devoted his career to the use of science in addressing the societal challenge of climate change. He's the president and executive director of the Woodwall Climate Research Center. And prior to that, he served as a senior policy analyst in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and as a senior advisor in the White House National Science and Technology Council. In these roles, he was involved in international climate negotiations, domestic and international climate policy, and coordinating US global climate change research. Prior to that, before joining the White House, Dr. Duffy also worked as the chief scientist at Climate Central, which is an organization dedicated to increasing public understanding and awareness of climate change. So we're super excited to have him, and we're just gonna get started with our questions.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here with all of you. Johannes didn't mention I actually graduated from Harvard a while ago, sometime in the mid-Holocene. So it's great to interact with all of you. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Duffy, the first question we have that we'll also post to the other panelists once they're able to join is, sure. What drew you into your climate work? Because obviously climate change is an issue that affects all of us, yeah. But even so, very few people kind of dedicate their lives to addressing it. So what drew you into it?
Well, I'll tell the story of that. I mean, as Johannes said, I got a graduate degree in physics, and even at the time I was doing that, I remember feeling like I was sort of visiting that world, meaning that I knew that I wasn't going to be, a professional physicist for the rest of my life. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to get some technical skills that I could apply to problems of societal relevance. And how I got involved in climate change actually is through my mom, in fact, who at the time was an academic climate researcher at Brown University, and she was working on paleoclimates, which are climates of the distant past, and specifically on ice ages and what causes ice ages and so forth. And I got interested in that from a scientific perspective. I also got interested in the idea of looking at past climates as a way of understanding what the future is going to look like. And it turns out that is actually still a powerful tool for giving us a glimpse of what the consequences of adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So, it was through talking to my mom actually about her work, and she was a physicist actually as well, that I got interested in the subject. And it never lost its appeal. And just because for me, what I want to do, and I feel grateful that I have the opportunity to do it every day, is to do something that lets me apply my technical background to the betterment of society. And I can say a word about my organization, Woodwall Climate Research Center. You probably haven't heard of it. The reason you probably haven't heard of it, well, one of the reasons anyway you probably haven't heard of it, is we changed the name of it a couple months ago. We've actually been around for 35 years. We're actually in Massachusetts. Although I'm not there now, but we're located in Woods Hole, down on the Cape. And we were founded actually in 1985 under the name Woods Hole Research Center. And we, for various reasons, decided to change our name and did do that a couple of months ago. And the name Woodwell is in honor of our founder, a guy named George Woodwell, who was an actual visionary who in the 80s foresaw the dangers of human-caused climate change, and he wanted to form this organization to be a bridge between science and decision makers, to do research specifically for the purpose of informing societal decisions and policies around climate change. And so we've been doing that since 1985. And it's remarkable that, and the vision of some of these folks to foresee what is happening today. And George Woodwell, for example, testified in the United States Senate about climate change in 1986. And, just to remind all of you, in 1986, climate change, I mean, we knew it was happening, but it certainly wasn't apparent, meaning that even just the signal of greenhouse gases in the global temperature record hadn't been seen. And certainly none of the consequences that we're experiencing now on almost a daily basis have been seen. So it was all pretty theoretical. And yet, occasionally I reread George's 1986 testimony, and he described, not perfectly, and not completely, but quite accurately, a lot of the things that are happening now, including the wildfires and the thawing of permafrost and greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost and all of these things. It's an interesting organization. And to tie this back to your question, it really is a great platform for folks who want to do technical work, but technical work that has direct application in the real world.
So you talked about how basically, that as going back as early as the 1980s, there have been people testifying about the threat of climate change. So I guess my next question is just very open-ended in the sense that, I'd like to know, why are we where we are today? Why has so little happened in a way? What are the big obstacles that you've encountered professionally or that you perceive to have prevented concerted action on the issue of climate change on the national level, on an international level, whichever it may be?
Well, it is a challenging problem. It requires global action.
I think he froze there for a second.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, sorry, you froze there for a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're back now, I think.
That's a problem on my end, sorry. One of the things that's different about climate change from other environmental problems is it really doesn't ever fix itself, at least not on any human timescale, meaning that, and that follows directly from the long lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so unlike, say, pollution of a water body, where if you shut off the source of the pollutant, the system flushes itself out quite quickly and actually gets better. Climate change really doesn't get better. And I think that's a big message that a lot of folks don't understand, that if we stop the addition of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, climate change isn't going to get better. It will only stop getting worse. And that's a really key that's a really key point. And then of course is what fundamentally what drives the urgency behind addressing climate change. And people ask me, and this question, in the context of, say, the wildfires out here in California this year, I was asked, is this the new normal? I get asked that a lot. And I always say, no, it's not the new normal. It's going to keep getting worse. And it will keep getting worse until we stop making the problem worse by stopping the addition of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So, your question of how do we, I think this is the challenge of how do we organize societally? How do we generate the political will to address the problem? And that really is the uber challenge. I don't have the answer to that. If I had the answer to that, but that's, I think, where folks like you can help play a role. But technically to solve this, I think it's extremely challenging. But I also have confidence in human ingenuity, and I think that we could, if we put our minds to things, we can do amazing things. But what worries me is just the lack of effort. That we're really not making the effort we need to make, and political will really is the missing ingredient. And unfortunately, every year that goes by narrows our options and makes the problem more challenging. And by narrowing our options, I mean, it narrows the range of outcomes for the future, right? Because again, carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere. It's not going to go anywhere.
I mean, 2 calls.
I think we're getting a little crosstalk. Carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere. It's not going to go anywhere. And so, the range of possible futures, the range of, possible futures for humanity and what the planet looks like and what life looks like, those options are narrowing, and the options that are disappearing are the better ones. And the possibilities just get worse and worse as the longer we delay.
Is there any one particular thing that you'd attribute this lack of political will to act on climate change to? Is this sort of a lack of understanding the challenges, or just that it's such a, I guess, people don't see the urgent political policymakers don't see the urgency of it, or what is?
Well, the over the years, decades, I mean, the public argument about this has moved. It's way behind where it needs to be, and it's certainly way behind where science is. But it's moved from, it's not happening, and we argued that forever. That, is climate change happening? Yes, no. Okay, yes, it's happening. And then it is, okay, is it caused by humans? We argued that forever, and then it was, well, it's happening and it's caused by humans, but it's not bad, it's good. Carbon dioxide feeds plants, it's great. And I think we've moved past that, and I think the consequences. I mean, this year in particular, 2020 was just a year when climate change really just, I think, kind of hit us over the head with all of the impacts. I don't think it's possible to reasonably argue that it's not a problem. And kind of right now, as I see it, where we are is, in terms of the public argument, it's become an economic argument, and it's an economic argument that's framed in a very one-sided way, meaning there's a lot of discussion about the economic consequences of climate policies. In other words, the economic consequences of the solutions, but there's very little conversation about the economic consequences of climate change itself. So, if I had to characterize it, I mean, I think what it comes down to is a lot of folks recognize that climate change is happening, but at the same time, I feel like they're fundamentally more afraid of the solution than they are of the problem. And as long as that remains true, it's hard to see how we're going to get much progress. So I think, and a lot of the work that I'm doing now with, the folks at Woodwell are doing, is about trying to address that by just illustrating the consequences of climate change. And if I can digress off topic for a minute, I'll talk about some of how we do that. And it's pretty basic stuff scientifically, but what we're looking at is we're essentially looking at extreme weather and the societal consequences of extreme weather. And the audience actually for a lot of this work, well, there's a number of audiences, but we actually started to look at this in the context of working with leaders in the world of business and finance. And what excited me about doing this in the first place was the idea of helping these folks to understand climate change as a risk. So this is the other side of the economic argument. And one of the things I've learned in doing this is that money people are quite pragmatic. And they're about the bottom line, and they listen to data. And so what we're doing with them is working to help them understand on a very specific granular level the economic risks from near-term climate change, from extreme weather of various forms. Near-term meaning 20, 30 years, because that's the time horizon these guys look at, investors and so forth. And again, it's very, very specific stuff, but big picture wise, it's essentially training them to think about, okay, climate change is a risk. And there's also, for investors, there are also opportunities, but mainly it's a risk. And it's just a new way for them to look at climate change. And what I think is powerful about this approach to working with the leaders of business and finance is that it's not, we're not appealing to them to make morally appropriate investments. We're not appealing to their altruism. It's an approach that's fundamentally based on self-interest. It's like, you need to know about this, you need to think about this, you need to be aware of this. And what I'm hoping is that this awareness of climate change as a business risk will propagate into action on their part. Action meaning reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully also action in terms of them engaging politically and trying to get some action on climate change. And one of the things I've said all along is that, and this gets back to the earlier question of why haven't we done more, is, in the United States, as you may be aware, a lot is driven by money. And I personally don't love that, but that is the way this place works. And when serious money people start agitating for climate action, I think we'll have climate action, and there certainly are signs of that. But maybe I'll pause here and wait for the next question. I could elaborate on that, but.
Something we were curious about is the way in which the current coronavirus pandemic is affecting the conversation around climate change. Especially, is there anything in the way the international community has responded or not responded to coronavirus that implies a way that we could respond to climate change?
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting question, and I think about it a bit, and in some way, COVID is sort of this. I view it as sort of this fast motion version of climate change, meaning that it spreads very quickly, obviously, and also the consequences of policies are felt very quickly. If you lock down, in 2 to 3 weeks, case numbers go down, and as predicted. And so here's Dan Schrag.
I apologize for being late. I got stuck on an urgent other call. I apologize, guys. Nice to see you, everybody.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
So we were talking about the question was analogies between, or lessons from COVID that can be applied to climate change. And I was saying COVID sort of, in some sense, this fast moving version of climate change. To me, so what do we extract from the COVID experience? One thing I keep saying over and over publicly is that COVID gives us, I think, a really vivid demonstration that policies based on science work, policies based on wishful thinking just don't work. And the same is true of climate change. It'll take longer to play out, but that's certainly true. I think the biggest thing, I'll stop in a second and give Dan a chance to weigh in, but that to me, perhaps the most important thing that I hope folks learn from COVID is simply that terrible things can happen on a global scale. And folks like Dan and I have been jumping up and down and warning about that for decades. And it doesn't really resonate. And I think it doesn't resonate because it's hard to believe that life can be fundamentally different from how it has been. And yet that is what climate change threatens to do to us. And I hope that the experience of COVID which has made life fundamentally different globally, just informs our imaginations a little bit and allows people to recognize that, yeah, you know, this kind of stuff can happen.
Let me just take a brief moment to introduce Professor Schrag at this point. Thank you so much for being here. Also, so Daniel Schrag is a professor of geology at Harvard and directs the Harvard University Center for the Environment. And he has spent much of his career also working on climate change, past, present, and future, as well as energy technology and policy. And from 2009 through 2017, Daniel Schrag served on President Obama's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology. So I guess our question to both of you, and if you want to weigh in on the earlier question about sort of the implications of the pandemic on climate change, Professor Schrag, you're welcome to do so. Our question for both of you is just, in your work as scientists, as researchers, what do you think is sort of the cutting edge? What is the most exciting, perhaps, to you personally, research being done right now to combat climate change, or that has implications on the fight against climate?
Well, so that's a big, broad question, because research is important, but we're also in a world that action matters too. And the answer is, so let's just step back from this for a second. And I think maybe what Phil was saying about the parallels or analogies between COVID and climate change is a nice launching point for that. So he's exactly right. COVID is like a fast moving, short time scale climate change. By the way, it's short time scale, but we still are really bad at dealing with the long time scale of COVID. So one of the lessons is humans are terrible at things with any kind of delay. Remember last summer, the governor of Georgia, governor of Florida opened up their states despite the CDC telling them that they needed to be going down and having, you know, a variety of metrics. They ignored that and opened them up. And for about 8 weeks or 10 weeks, case numbers didn't go up much. And they said, aha, those idiot epidemiologists, they didn't know what they were talking about. And then slowly and steadily, cases started to rise and deaths started to go up. Hospital admissions started to go up. And you know what? That's the nature of this beast, which is there is a kind of 2 to 6 week time scale with COVID, that when you start seeing numbers, when you start seeing hospitalizations and deaths, that's several weeks behind what's already happened in terms of the transmission. And the nature of our society is that a certain amount of transmission is going to beget a certain amount of additional transmission. And therefore it's really hard without a complete Chinese style shutdown. Once it's at that stage, you can't turn on a dime. The thing that Phil and my friend John Holdren said many years ago in the Clinton administration about climate change, I think is true about COVID as well. You're driving a super tanker, you're not driving a sports car. You can't just turn on a dime. By the time you see a problem, there's so much momentum that you're stuck. So let's talk about Massachusetts. We're at sort of 2,500 new cases a day. Frankly, I'll be amazed if Harvard makes it to Thanksgiving, even though that's only a week and a half away. I think that the high number of caseloads in in Massachusetts is boding very badly for Tufts, BU, Northeastern, because everything was going great as long as the overall caseload was low. And now we're seeing it skyrocket. I guess UConn had a big outbreak and Yale had a big outbreak last week. You know, let's see how it goes. I hope I'm wrong. But the fact is there is a time scale for this. And the time scale, looking at Georgia and Florida last summer, was 8 to 10 weeks. And 8 to 10 weeks basically gets you from September to November, right? But now we're beginning to see it break down.
Yeah.
And I think the same is with climate change, except the time scale is no longer 8 to 10 weeks. The time scale, and by the way, humans are terrible at making decisions because in those 8 to 10 weeks, we think everything's going well. The Dean of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, Claudine Gay, a few weeks ago wrote a letter congratulating the students for how well they've done, and it probably means we can bring more students back in the spring. Honestly, that's backward looking, not forward looking. If you look forward, you say, by mid-January, when the students are supposed to be coming back, we're going to probably be 3,000 or 4,000 cases a day. Hospitals are going to be full. There's no way we're going to be able to bring students back. I hope I'm wrong about that, but that's what it looks like. And with climate change, the delays are not 10 weeks. They're 10 years to thousands of years. And so as bad as we are at timescales of 8 weeks to 10 weeks, we're hopeless on timescales of decades to centuries to millennia. And that's the real problem of climate change. Plus, it's a global collective action. Phil's trying to jump in. Go ahead, Phil.
No, it is. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, and we won't do what needs to be done when mistaken policies result in people dying weeks later, and that's pretty fast feedback. And, it's also very powerful feedback. People die, and yet that is not apparently enough. And, well, I'm frankly just at this moment sitting here horrified that, we've got 150,000 new cases a day, 1,000 people dying a day, and the federal, at the federal level, as far as I can see, we're doing absolutely nothing. There's no effort being made to address the problem. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's a political comment.
It's terrifying. 150,000 cases a day. I mean,
right.
And it's creeping up. And by the way, deaths rise 2 to 3 weeks later.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're going to probably be several thousand people are going to die every day 2 weeks from now. That's right. What it looks like.
It's going to be 9/11 every day. It's going to be Pearl Harbor every day.
And
what are we doing about it?
I have a young colleague of mine, her parents both had COVID in Cincinnati, and her mother died and her father recovered, but is still scarred from it. This is real, and they were in their 60s. So this is real and tragic, and brace yourself. It's going to be a dark, cold winter. So let's get back to climate change. So on the climate change front, this is, I think a lot of people don't understand what we've already committed ourselves to. Every summer, Greenland is melting, much more than the new snow that's added in the wintertime. And we're losing the equivalent of only about 1 millimeter per year of sea level rise. Now, that's not that much, right? 1 millimeter of sea level rise, centimeter a decade. Doesn't sound too terrible. But the change that's happened there just in the last 20 years is mind-boggling. And if you think that change is going to stop, so the answer is, from a scientific perspective, we have already committed to the complete melting of Greenland. There's no question about that geologically, scientifically. The question is how fast. If it takes 1,000 years, maybe it'll be slow enough that it's fine, but it may be a lot faster than that. In Antarctica, the newest data suggests that a particular glacial system called the Thwaites Glacier, that my colleague Richard Alley has spent a lot of time studying, he's from Penn State, looks like it's either already past the tipping point or close to that tipping point. But what it has the potential to do is add 3 to 4 meters of sea level rise in less than 100 years, and it could be less than 50 years. Now, it's unlikely to happen in the next 50 years. So for all of us here, maybe even in the next 100 years, for all of us, at least for me and Phil, we're never going to see that. But imagine that your children, my grandchildren, which I don't have any yet, are going to essentially be burdened with 3 meters of sea level rise over 50 years. How do you think about that? How do you think about the we talk about climate justice. To me, the biggest part of climate justice is the intergenerational aspect of it. We are making decisions today that are committing future generations to this tragedy. Imagine if COVID, where the deaths happened, but the deaths happened 100 years from now to humans who are not yet born. So we're making decisions about the spread of this virus that lay dormant for 100 years and then killed a whole bunch of people 100 years from now. That's what we're talking about with climate change.
And that, there's a lot to be said about equity issues, but one of the ones that Dan just raised, I think doesn't get as much attention as it should, and that's intergenerational equity. And, as Dan said, these folks, our grandkids and my grandkids like yours are hypothetical, Dan, but they're going to live in a different world, and it's not fair to them. And they have obviously no voice in these decisions, and yet that's it. And yeah, the thing that, in terms of the things that scare me, I mean, it's these, what we call in the science world, thresholds and tipping points. And Dan mentioned one, the threshold of, we've committed to the complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And that's history. That probably happened, I don't know, a decade ago. When do you think, Dan? But there's others. I mean, that's one threshold, and glacier loss is one. One of the things that we work on at my center is greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost. And that is a potentially terrifying phenomenon, because what's happening is the Arctic is warming. It's warming faster than the rest of the planet for reasons we understand pretty well. And as it thaws, the organic matter in the soil, permafrost, which has been sitting there frozen for tens of thousands of years, starts to decompose, and it emits greenhouse gases. It emits carbon dioxide, it emits methane. And there's complexities to it, and yada, yada, and so forth. And I don't want to overstate the certainty of what's happening, but it's certain, that permafrost is certainly melting, and it is certainly a gigantic carbon reservoir. And so the scenario that is terrifying, I think, is that that thawing permafrost starts to emit greenhouse gases in a way that causes us to lose control of our destiny. I mean, right now, for all the challenges we face, we at least theoretically control our destiny. But if permafrost starts emitting massive greenhouse gases, then I don't know what we do. I literally don't know what we do.
Yeah, those are terrifying problems, and we haven't even started to confront those yet. And yeah, the part of the topic of this whole gathering, I think, is to focus on activism. What can we do about it? And I think, I've had a really interesting reaction to a lot of the youth activism on climate change, whether it's Greta Thunberg or whether it's Sunrise Movement. And Varshini Prakash is a friend of mine who started, one of the founders of Sunrise. I think it's so awesome what these individuals and groups have done. And I think it's absolutely essential that, frankly, the youth are engaged on this issue. And their attitude about, okay, we need to do this now, like in 10 years, we need to fix it now, is completely logical and completely, if I were them, that's exactly what I would be demanding. And unfortunately, I'm older and have studied this for long enough to realize that, number one, the problem can't be fixed in 10 years. It's a global collective action problem, and the infrastructure that essentially undergirds our whole the energy system that undergirds our whole economy is not going to be replaced in 10 years. In fact, doing it even by 2050 looks to me, frankly, it looks to me like it's impossible. And again, I would love to be wrong about this, but it doesn't look possible to me. Lovely that China said they're going to decarbonize by 2060. Great that Germany and the UK have said they're going to do it by 2050. I don't believe any of them will actually get there. But much better that they've committed to it than the US, which has done nothing. But it's frustrating. If I were 20 years old, 18 years old, I would be angry. What have you guys done to my future?
I'm angry. I'm 64 years old and I'm angry.
Yeah.
George Woodwell, who founded my center, is 92 years old. And I call him up, I go, George, how you doing? He goes, well, I'm mad as hell. And that's appropriate.
It is appropriate, but this particular demand, at the same time, it's very frustrating. Because I'll tell you, when I listen to the rhetoric, for example, during the Democratic primary, was weird this year. The entire focus on climate change really came down to essentially two things. One, there was I'm going to ban fracking. There was that discussion. Lost was the analysis that the president of the United States doesn't actually have the authority to ban fracking. So, you know, if they wanted to become a dictator, that's fine. But if I'm sitting in Pennsylvania, the Department of Environmental Protection can put restrictions on it. The governor of Pennsylvania can, but the president of the United States doesn't have authority to do that. So number one, a lot of the rhetoric on this, to me, was pandering to demonstrate environmental commitment. But even worse was that when climate came up, it was, what year am I going to get to zero emissions? Joe Biden said 2050. Elizabeth Warren said she could do it by 2040. Bernie Sanders said, I'm going to do it with 2030, before 2030. And of course, the other metric was, how many trillions of dollars am I going to spend out of the federal government on this? So frankly, it was frustrating to me that people took this as a metric. Literally, people said to me, including students at the Kennedy School, at the business school, Joe Biden doesn't care about climate change because he's only going to decarbonize by 2050. My response to them was, Bernie Sanders has showed me that either he's just pandering to you, or he really doesn't understand the problem, or both. And I think it's probably some of both. And the same with Elizabeth Warren, because you can't decarbonize the US by 2030. It is not possible. In my class, we talk about this. I have students design a low carbon economy and they try. And you know, just to give you an example, 100% renewable electricity by 2030, which is 100% renewable everything by 2030, which was Sanders' plan, requires about 5,000 gigawatts at least of new wind and solar, at least, and maybe much more. We're building 20 gigawatts a year. So that's like 200 or 300 years of construction. And the whole world production of solar panels last year was about 120 gigawatts. So the idea that you can build 5,000 gigawatts in 10 years, like, that's insane.
Right.
That's just ridiculous. And yet for some reason, I take, you know, I'm a progressive Democrat. I'm pissed off that my progressive Democratic colleagues actually took that seriously. Like, numbers matter. And when Trump lies about numbers and the Republicans swallow it, it frustrates me. But it frustrates me even more when people who agree with me politically don't actually take the real world seriously. So this is something to think about.
But you know, in terms of leadership, I mean, I think fundamentally neither leaders in neither party have been willing to stand up and tell people the truth, and that this is what we're facing, and these are the sacrifices that will be required. And that's political death to talk about sacrifices. It's the S word, but that is reality. And if, you know, and a good leader, I mean, I read, you know, I read Winston Churchill's account of World War II, and he said that about Hitler in the 30s, that the British, you know, none of the British leaders had the courage to stand up and tell the population, this guy is a threat and it needs to be addressed now. and we can have a small war now, or we can have a big war later, but this guy is not going to go away. And nobody had the guts to stand up and say that. And that's kind of where we are with climate change. Nobody has the guts to stand up and say, this is a situation, this is what we're facing, this is what we need to do to address it. And by the way, nobody said that on COVID either. And that's what it takes. And and maybe I'm naive, and maybe that would be political suicide for anybody to do that. But I don't see how we make progress without it. I'll say one more thing, and that is, in terms of youth activism, I think it's super powerful. And our democracy is not functioning super well right now, and it responds more to money than anything else. But if enough people clamor for things and are politically active and vote and run for office and make noise, change does happen. I mean, I think ultimately what you have to do is you have to convince politicians that they will lose the next election if they don't do the right thing. And it's as simple as that. And that's what motivates them, is keeping their jobs. And I wish that weren't the case, but that is the way it is. And
Yeah,
if that's what's at stake for them, they'll get religion.
I agree, and telling the truth is important. Who else? I don't know if you would say your organization is a research organization, Phil,
Yes.
not an environmental advocacy organization, although it's a little bit of both, but mostly research.
Yes.
But the big NGOs, the big environmental NGOs, have been lying to people too, because their donors want it, right? They've been telling people there's this big problem and it's really going to get worse, but if you just give us money, we can solve it. And it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. Now, I mean, this is really important, really sad stuff. But as you mentioned, part of this meeting, we're hoping, is to get young people to think about, what can we do? So we have, 20 young people who obviously care enough about this issue to join this meeting. And so we definitely wanted to open it up and let people ask questions if they have any. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to, oh, okay, awesome. So Aiden Gibbons, it looks like you have a question if you want to ask that, or post it in the chat, either way.
Yeah, sure. So I'll ask a question. I know, Philip, you were kind of alluding to the fact that you think like political pressure is probably the greatest means of creating change, in the sense that like if candidates don't think that a anti-climate change or anti-regulation, anti-building out green energy approach is helpful, they won't endorse it. I'm wondering if you both maybe could like weigh on, I guess, the importance of political pressure versus like other either pressure or innovations, like maybe like in the private sector, maybe like individuals changing their behavior or thoughts on climate change. I'm just kind of wondering, aside from political pressure, what are ways to create change, and kind of how would you weigh them comparatively, if that makes sense?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, well, I described earlier our work with leaders in the world of business and finance, and again, that what we get out of that in terms of our mission as a nonprofit is helping them to understand the risk that they face, the risk to their bottom line from climate change. And I hope that and I expect it will push them to engage politically. And actually, one of the things I wanted to mention, there was a remarkable report actually released by the Trump administration, believe it or not, about a month ago, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and which is the most boring sounding thing in the world. But it is a federal body which regulates the financial industry. And they put out, again, about a month ago, a very, very hard-hitting report saying, we need carbon pricing, we need action. And that kind of thing, I think, has the potential to help move the needle.
And maybe if I could just ask like one quick follow-up on, so I know, Dan, I've actually talked with you about this question a little bit, but do you think it's more helpful politically to be advocating for kind of more progressive, bold solutions that might not garner as much support, but are kind of more bold in nature, or go with kind of a more conservative approach of maybe trying to get kind of 10 or 15, or maybe get 10 or 15% of conservatives who are generally less, I guess, generous on climate policy to back some sort of policy? Like, what do you think would be the most meaningful way for political advocacy and advocacy in that sense?
So I'll tell you, the honest answer is that it's not an either or. Multiple things have to happen on multiple timescales. I founded an NGO with a friend of mine from the marketing world that's brought together about 200 advertising agencies to do pro bono work on climate change.
Mhm.
We created a big ad called, big campaign called Vote Like a Madre, where we had Jennifer Lopez and a number of other people, Lin-Manuel Miranda, a number of other people. The target was specifically Latina mothers. You can go to votelikeamadre.com and read about it. Our organization is invisible because we did it. We had local host organizations focused on the Latina community to do it. But our research, it's all, our approach is all data based. We use ads that are effective. And we were targeting specific communities. It turns out Latina mothers are the most movable on climate change. Half of them are Republicans. Many are independents, and they actually care about this. And so getting influencers like Jennifer Lopez and others, and you know what? We calculated that we actually had a movable, sizable impact in Arizona this year, which turns out to have been a pretty close election, about 11,000 votes right now. So, every little bit helps, right? We have another campaign we're just gearing up called Science Moms that's geared more generally to suburban mothers. That's worth trying. Let's see if it's effective. Similarly, I actually think Bill McKibben, 350.org, yelling and screaming is awesome. I love Bill. He's a close friend. And you know what? He puts pressure. But let me be clear. I don't want Bill to make policy. But I want Bill to yell and scream. I don't want Greta Thunberg to make policy. And what I love about Greta Thunberg is she says, I'm 18 years old or 16 or 17 or however old she is. You're the experts. You're supposed, I'm telling you to go solve the problem. I'm not going to tell you how to solve it. I'm 17 years old, right? And by the way, that's exactly right. God bless her, right? That's the point. So everybody has a role in this. I think so. And similarly, do I think Sunrise's demands for decarbonization by 2030 and the Green New Deal are feasible? Absolutely not. Do I think they'll be politically viable? Absolutely not. Do I think that their contribution has helped push the ball forward on this issue? Absolutely. And so that's how I think about it, Aidan. And I know that sounds contradictory, right? I
think that makes more or less sense. Kind of like in terms of policy, maybe you have to be more pragmatic, but in terms of advocacy, it's kind of like helpful to have it on sort of all different levels.
Exactly.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Aidan. We had a question from Ezekiel, I think, if you want to unmute yourself and ask it.
Oh, hi. Yeah. And I just have a question on how you and why you think decarbonizing between by 2030 is infeasible. Like basically, like what part of the carbon economy is too difficult to solve? Because when I think of, like policies like carbon taxes, they don't really restructure the economy. They just sort of give incentives, right? And is there like what restructuring is too hard to solve? carbon economy problem, though, is basically my question.
So don't, let me be clear. I don't think that the problems are too hard to solve. I think they're too hard to solve in 10 years, which is a different thing. And frankly, we spend about a month on this in my class. I'm not going to take you through a whole discussion of the energy system of the world, but a lot of people, or of the US, a lot of people aren't aware of the energy system of the US and how much energy goes into residential and commercial heating, how much energy goes into industrial sector, and how much energy goes into transportation. You know, for example, what are you going to do about jet fuel? Jet fuel uses about 1.8 million barrels of oil a day, at least before the pandemic. How are you going to fly jets without petroleum? That's a really hard problem. There's some ideas, but they're really tough trade-offs. It's what I call a whack-a-mole problem. You know, you solve it here and a problem ends up elsewhere. Let's suppose you replace the jet fuel with biofuel, which has been proposed. The amount of biomass you need would be multiples of the arable land of the US. So that's a bit of a problem, right? We're not going to conquer Brazil and take over the Amazon so we can turn it into a plantation, at least I hope we don't, to grow biofuel for flying our airplanes. That's the scale of what we're talking about. And by the way, jet fuel is like 1.8 million barrels a day. The US uses 20. So there are lots of other things that are really difficult. And all of those things involve trillions of dollars of infrastructure. Is it technologically impossible? Absolutely not. I could write down a way of doing it, but it would be at a cost that in a democratic society, people would be unwilling to bear. I was on the phone last night on a Zoom call with colleagues from Tsinghua University in Beijing. It turns out they think about this very differently because in the Chinese economy, there's central planning. And if President Xi says, we're going to do this, they do it. If President Xi says, we're going to switch to electric vehicles, all vehicles in China will become electric. The President of the United States doesn't have that authority. And
Not yet.
it's hard. So this is a very difficult problem. And the other point that a lot of people don't understand, and by the way, it's at the heart of what's wrong with the Green New Deal as well, is they misunderstand the nature of what we're trying to do. The idea is we're supposed to decarbonize the US as quickly as possible, but that's not the goal. The goal is to decarbonize the world as quickly as possible. The climate system doesn't care about the US, it cares about the world. Now, I believe that US leadership in this is absolutely critical. But here's what is important to understand about leadership. Leadership is not just charging ahead. Leadership is leading in such a way that other people follow you. And so our goal is not to decarbonize the US as quickly as possible. It's to decarbonize the US as quickly as possible in a way that looks attractive to every other country in the world. If we just were to spend $16 trillion like Bernie Sanders proposed and buy this down, you know what? Every other country would run the other direction because we wouldn't have done it in a smart way that makes it look attractive to every other country in the world. That's a much harder thing to do, but that's the nature of the collective action problem that we're given. Hezekiah, I don't know if that answers your question, but does that make sense?
Yes. And I don't know if it should be more emphasized that this future transitioning to decarbonizing will also have to reduce our consumption in general as people in the economy. And I don't know if that also will be democratically viable.
So I'll tell you, democratically and globally is another problem too. So there's a movement in the environmental movement to focus on consumption. There's some people who say, we have to reduce consumption. I'm sympathetic to that view. And certainly higher prices will lead to reduction in consumption. That's how it works, and that will happen naturally. But the idea that, you know, there's almost a nostalgia for kind of simpler living, more in tune with the land. You see this in the local agriculture movement. You see this in a variety of other parts of the environmental movement. In Europe, there's a group that's very strong on this. The problem is, I don't believe that's going to be effective globally. I don't believe that, if you've ever gone to Asia looking at people who are rapidly developing, but still very poor compared to the US, for us to tell them they should simplify their lives sounds pretty hypocritical. And I don't think it's going to be effective. I think what would be, my personal view is that developing the technology that can allow people to consume without having such negative impacts on the environment is a better approach. But there is a deeper fundamental question, which goes all the way back to the work on limits to growth from 50 years ago, that is a much deeper philosophical discussion. Ezekiel, I don't know how to solve that. Right now, we're still in a world with growing population, although education of women and higher economic levels are gradually reducing the fertility rate. What the world looks like 100 years ago from now, when population is declining, I think is a fascinating question. But it seems so far off right now. I'm kind of focused on what we have to do in the next decade.
It sure does.
We had a question from Patricia in the chat asking if you guys could provide your thoughts on Project Drawdown, which is actually not an initiative that I'm familiar with, but if either of you are and want to talk about it.
So I've looked at their material pretty carefully. I think Project Drawdown is an example of a whole bunch of, there's a lot of these different sort of scenarios and plans for how to get to low carbon. I think it comes out of, I think it's based in San Francisco. It's kind of a Silicon Valley outstretch, and it tends to be, you know, magical technology believing, and it often is. When I read it, I feel like it's a little bit naive about real world energy solutions that are actually economical. I find it to be, you know, half of it to be fairy tales, and there's some really good stuff in there, and it's some combination. But energy systems are much more complicated than the way they make it seem. Real changes to our energy system. I'm actually working on a memo right now for, well, it's not for, but it is targeting the transition team with a colleague of mine who's an economist at Harvard. And I'll tell you what we're focusing on. We're focusing on a few key things that we think we can actually get done in the next 4 years. One of them, and there's some good news that people should remember. In the Trump administration, remember, Trump hates wind. He hates it. For some reason, it's like irrational, but he hates it. 75% of new electricity capacity this year is wind and solar. Why is that? It's not because the Trump administration has been nice to wind. The truth is, most of the energy system happens independent from the federal government. Federal government doesn't control it. The federal government isn't even the major force on it. State governments are much more important. The federal government, so the reason 75% of our new electricity generation is wind and solar is because it's cheaper. And that's good news. It's cheaper. It's gotten cheaper, and that wasn't true 10 years ago. The Obama administration, we had almost $100 billion for stimulus after the financial crisis in 2009 for energy. And frankly, most of it was wasted. It wasn't, and none of it was really helping wind and solar because it was so expensive. It wasn't even an option. 12 years later, wind and solar are the answer. It's a little boring. We have to build more of it. But how do you accelerate that build out? And so we have a number of ideas about how to do that. The other thing that we think is really close to an economic tipping point is electric vehicles. We think in the next several years, electric vehicles are going to be on price parity with gasoline powered vehicles, certainly for the total cost of ownership. My wife and I just bought a plug-in hybrid, and the plug-in hybrid and the gasoline powered version of the same car were within $2,000 or $3,000 price. And I got a $5,000 rebate on the plug-in version. So for me, the plug-in version was $2,000 cheaper than the gasoline version of the same car. That's interesting, right? So I think this transition is happening. And the question is, how can the federal government accelerate that? Again, the federal government doesn't control who buys what cars. There are CAFE standards, but frankly, one of the most important things will be subsidies, cost sharing for gas stations installing level 3 chargers all over the country. So range anxiety goes away. That's going to be really important. So and maybe subsidies for EV factories across the US done in the name of jobs and supporting the automobile industry, not through climate, right? It's not a climate play, it's a jobs play. And the Republicans may get behind that because it supports jobs in Ohio, jobs in Alabama. And that's what we're focusing on. Does that answer your question?
I think that was a great answer. Yeah, I actually wanted to sort of end with this question too. Just, I think you already touched a bit on that, Professor Schrag, but sort of what keeps you positive or optimistic, perhaps, even though this feature, as we've talked about, looks fairly bleak, right? What is there anything that any grounds for hope going forward? Any initiatives, projects? If you want to jump in
Well,
here.
do you want to start, or do you want to end? It's your.
No, I'll start. I mean, actually, this is not a pandering answer. It's a true answer. I mean, one of the things that gives me hope is young folks like you engaging in this problem, and that is and will be very, very effective. And I know I know the movement will grow, and that's incredibly important. The other thing I've already mentioned is that, and I clearly see this working with folks in the world of business and finance. They are recognizing this as a threat to their businesses, and even as a threat to their fundamental business models. And that's also, that to me, that's also very, very encouraging. But I guess I will say, it's looking at the big picture and the magnitude of what needs to be done and the urgency and the timing, and where we are in terms of thresholds and tipping points in the physical system. It's not easy to feel like the future is going to be great. I'll put it that way. But I also feel, I feel like, the stakes are so high that we can't stop. We have to do everything we can. There's no alternative.
I agree completely with what Philip just said. And let me say one other thing. Climate change is scary. I mean, what happened this fall in California and Oregon with the fires was terrifying. I had students in my class who had to evacuate their homes. And, we're zooming into class from a motel 100 miles away from their home. That was pretty scary.
Yeah.
It was real.
No,
being said,
I'll interrupt and I'll chime in. I'm sitting in California in a high fire risk zone right now. And, well, I think the fire season is about to end. It's going to rain, but my bag is packed. My car is pointed. I backed into the garage so I can floor it out of there,
It's a real deal.
Yeah.
But at the same time, humans are incredibly innovative, and we're incredibly capable of adaptation. We're bad at long time scales, as I said earlier, and we're really bad at collective action. We're tribal. we tend to be nationalistic and all of that. So cooperating on a global problem like this. But when it comes to actually managing the impacts, that's what we're really good at. I actually have a lot of hope that humans will be okay. I have much less hope for the natural world, but I have a lot of hope that humans will manage what's coming. Unfortunately, there are many people in the world that will not, that will suffer tremendously and even die. So I don't want to make light of that. But you should understand that there are more than 1 billion people in the world today who are suffering pretty badly. And so poverty is a horrible thing in whatever state, whatever part of the world. But I am hopeful that humans will navigate through this, not necessarily with the right foresight. And I'm pretty convinced that we will geologically change the planet in a way that is extraordinary. Talking about the Anthropocene, I think, is appropriate because we really will change the Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. But I think there are paths forward, and with hard work and cleverness, we will do a lot to protect many people. And though that is absolutely noble work, and work that is worth putting our shoulder to the wheel and doing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much to the both of you for being here. Again, we're sorry apparently it seems like Jerome Foster and Jean-Paul José couldn't join us, two climate activists we were hoping on, but we'll follow up with them and try to get them on in some way or another. In any case, I think that was, for me at least personally, a fascinating conversation, and I hope you guys in the audience enjoyed it as well. So thanks again so much for being here.
Thank you. And Philip, great to see you. And
great to see you, Dan. And it is a pleasure. And just keep on doing what you're doing. And you all are the future and the solution. And don't be discouraged by two old men who are been around long enough to be cynical. Figure out the solutions that we can't figure out.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you guys. Yeah.